Every morning before the city woke up fully, a man could be seen walking down Maple Street with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a small cart full of spray paint cans. His jacket was always a little dusty, his shoes worn out, and his hands, always marked with different colors of paint. Nobody really knew who he was or where he came from. People only knew him as the street artist. He always chose the same corner beside the old bakery that smelled like fresh bread and coffee every morning. There was a long brick wall there, cracked and faded like it had seen too many seasons go by. To everyone else, it was just another wall, but to him, it was a blank canvas waiting to come alive. He would set down his cart quietly, pull out a few cans, and start spraying the first layer of paint as the sun began to rise. His movements were calm, almost careful, like he was afraid to disturb the peace of the early morning. The sound of the spray can, that soft hiss, became part of the city's dawn rhythm. People walking by on their way to work would slow down for a moment, curious to see what new colors were taking shape. Sometimes he painted city skylines glowing with sunset colors. Other times it was faces of people nobody recognized but somehow felt familiar. A woman smiling sadly, a child reaching toward something unseen, a man playing a violin under the stars. Every mural looked alive. Every brush of color carried a kind of emotion you couldn't describe with words, but no one ever spoke to him much. He didn't invite conversation, and people respected that quiet mystery. Shopkeepers would nod to him, and he'd nod back. Once in a while, someone would leave a cup of coffee near his cart without saying a word, and he'd raise his hand slightly in thanks. That was all. Children loved to watch him. They'd gather in small groups, whispering and giggling as they tried to guess what he was painting next. Sometimes he'd look at them and smile, but he never stopped working. He painted with focus, like every second mattered. By late morning, when the city became busy, his wall would already be halfway done. The smell of paint mixed with the scent of fresh bread and car exhaust. People passed by, phones in their hands, snapping photos to post online. "The Maple Street artist strikes again," some captions said. His art had become part of the neighborhood's identity, like an unspoken gift to anyone who walked by. But behind that quiet routine, there was something else. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, you could see him pause for a second and stare at the wall, lost in thought. His eyes, always calm, carried a strange kind of sadness, like he was painting not for fame, not for money, but for something much deeper, maybe for someone who wasn't there anymore. He never asked for payment, never signed his work. When people offered him money, he always smiled and shook his head gently. He seemed content just to see people stop even for a moment to feel something because of his art. That was his reward. At noon, he would take a break. He'd sit on the curb with his old thermos drinking tea or coffee, depending on what someone had brought him that day. The same songbirds would perch on the streetlight above, chirping softly. He'd look at them for a moment, then glance at the wall again, as if comparing his colors to their feathers, and then he'd get back to work, adding more life to the bricks. Once an old man passing by stopped and asked him quietly, "Why do you paint these walls when you know they'll fade with the rain?" The artist smiled a little and said, "Because life fades too, but we still live it fully." The old man nodded, not sure what to say next, and kept walking. The artist returned to his work, as if nothing happened. That was just the kind of person he was, quiet, humble, and full of meaning hidden behind few words. Even though he worked in public, he lived like a ghost. Nobody saw where he went when the sun went down. Some said he stayed in a small apartment nearby. Others thought he lived in one of those old warehouses by the river. Nobody knew for sure. By nightfall, his cart would be gone and only his artwork remained, shining under the streetlights like something magical. The people in the neighborhood started to feel like they knew him, even if they didn't. His murals reflected their lives somehow. A mother once said, "That's how I feel every time I look at his wall, like he paints what I can't say." Kids would draw his art in their notebooks. The bakery owner said business had doubled because tourists came to see the Maple Street murals. He was becoming part of everyone's story, but nobody was part of his. Sometimes, after finishing a mural, he'd stand a few feet away and look at it for a long time. If someone approached him to talk, he'd listen politely, but his answers were always short, soft-spoken. His voice had that tone of someone who had seen a lot, felt a lot, but didn't want to talk about it. The truth was, Nobody really knew the story behind those hands that created beauty every day. Nobody knew what had brought him to these streets or what he had left behind. Yet there was something healing in the way he painted. The city was full of noise and hurry, but when you stood in front of his mural, time seemed to slow down. It was like being reminded that there's still beauty in simple things, still hope in broken places. One cold morning in winter, when frost touched the rooftops, he came as usual, pulling his cart. His breath formed small clouds in the air, but that day he didn't start painting right away. He just stood there for a while, staring at the blank wall, lost in thought. A few people noticed and wondered if something was wrong. Then he took out a small photograph from his jacket pocket. No one could see what was in it. Looked at it for a few seconds, then tucked it back in and began painting again. This time his strokes were faster, stronger. He painted a young boy sitting on a curb, holding something that looked like a small piano. Around the boy, colors exploded like sound waves. The picture looked alive, filled with energy and emotion. When it was done, people couldn't stop staring. A woman whispered, "It's beautiful." But why the piano? No one knew, and the artist didn't say a word. After finishing, he packed his things and quietly left, leaving behind a mural that felt different, more personal. That was the first time anyone noticed a musical instrument in his work. Over the next few weeks, he continued painting, but small signs of music started appearing in all his murals. Piano keys, violins, sheet music hidden between layers of color. It was subtle, but it was there. It was as if the walls had begun to sing. The locals started to wonder, did the artist have something to do with music? No one had ever seen him touch an instrument. He never wore headphones, never hummed a tune. But there was something about the way his art flowed, like it followed a rhythm only he could hear. The mystery made him even more fascinating. Some teenagers made videos about him, calling him the silent composer. Others tried to talk to him, asking if he played music, but he just smiled and went back to painting. His silence only added to his legend. Then one day it rained heavily. The city streets were soaked and people ran for cover. The artist, too, tried to protect his work, but the colors on the wall began to drip and blend. He stood there under a small umbrella, watching his mural slowly fade away. For the first time, people saw him look truly sad. He didn't try to fix it. He just stood still, eyes lost in the melting paint as if watching a memory disappear. When the rain finally stopped, he walked down the street, his cart rattling behind him. Nobody knew where he was going, but his steps led him toward the small cafe at the end of the block, a place he had never entered before. The old wooden sign above the door read, "Maple Street Cafe." From inside, the faint sound of laughter and the smell of warm pastries filled the air. And near the corner of the cafe, through the window stood something unexpected, a small, dusty piano. The artist stopped for a moment, looking at it from outside. He didn't move for nearly a minute. Then, without saying a word, he opened the door and walked in. That was the moment when everything began to change. The small cafe was warm compared to the cold, wet street outside. The artist stepped in quietly, pushing the door that made a little bell ring. A few people turned to look, but then went back to their coffee and quiet conversations. He stood near the entrance for a moment, shaking off the rain from his jacket before walking slowly toward the counter. The smell of freshly baked bread and roasted coffee beans filled the air. The soft sound of a radio played an old song in the background, blending perfectly with the clinking of cups and low chatter. It was the kind of place where time moved slower, the kind of place where people came to rest their minds for a while. The woman behind the counter smiled. "Cold day, huh? You look soaked. Want something warm to drink?" He nodded and said softly, "Just coffee, please." His voice was calm, almost tired, but kind. While waiting, his eyes wandered around the room. The cafe was small but cozy, with old pictures hanging on the walls. Pictures of the neighborhood from years ago, before the big buildings and traffic lights. There were small tables near the windows. And in the corner, almost hidden behind a plant, stood the piano he had seen from outside. It was old, its wooden surface scratched and faded, and one of the keys looked chipped. A thin layer of dust covered the top, showing it hadn't been played in a long time. Yet something about it pulled his attention. He kept looking at it while sipping his coffee. He sat near the window, watching the rain continue to fall on the street. His mural outside was now just a blur of color, washed away by the storm. He didn't seem angry or frustrated, just quiet, thoughtful. Every now and then his gaze returned to the piano, as if it was calling to him. After a while, the waitress, a friendly woman with a kind smile, walked over to his table. "You're the one who paints those walls outside, right?" she asked. He gave a small nod. "They're beautiful," she said warmly. "You make this street come alive." He smiled politely. "Thank you," he said softly, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. She hesitated for a moment, then asked playfully, "You ever play the piano too?" "You've been looking at it for the last 10 minutes. The artist looked a bit surprised. He chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "A long time ago," he said. "I used to." "Oh, really?" she said with interest. "You should play sometime." "It's been sitting there for years. No one touches it anymore," he didn't answer. He just smiled again, but his eyes drifted back to the piano. For a second, he looked like someone remembering another life. A life filled with something he had lost long ago. The rain kept falling, tapping gently against the windows. The cafe grew quieter as people left one by one. Only a few stayed, reading or staring at their phones. The artist sat there, listening to the rhythm of the rain, his mind far away. Finally, as if something inside him gave him a little push, he stood up and walked toward the piano. The waitress noticed and smiled. "Go ahead," she said softly. "Let's see if it still works." He sat down carefully on the old wooden bench. His fingers hovered above the keys but didn't touch them right away. He took a deep breath as if preparing himself for something heavy. Then slowly he pressed one key. It made a dull sound, slightly out of tune, but it still carried that familiar warmth of real piano music. He pressed another key, then another. Soon both his hands were moving gently across the keyboard, testing, remembering. The first few notes were hesitant, like footsteps on forgotten ground. Then something changed. His fingers began to move faster, smoother, as if they had woken up from a long sleep. The music that came out wasn't loud or showy. It was soft, deep, and full of emotion. It sounded like a story. One that started in sadness, traveled through memory, and reached for peace. The cafe grew completely silent. Even the rain outside seemed to listen. The waitress froze where she stood, a cup still in her hand. A man reading his newspaper lowered it slowly, eyes fixed on the artist. Two students by the window stopped whispering. Everyone was drawn in, as if the music had filled every corner of the room with light. The artist's face changed as he played. The calm expression he always had while painting turned into something more alive. His eyes were closed now, and his body swayed slightly with the rhythm. Every note seemed to come straight from his heart, not just sound, but emotion given shape. It was like he wasn't just playing the piano. He was talking through it. A few minutes passed, but nobody moved. The piece became more powerful. A mix of beauty and sorrow, like remembering someone you loved and lost but still cherished deeply. The notes rose and fell like waves, carrying pieces of his soul. The sound of the old piano filled the cafe like warm sunlight after a storm. When he reached the last note, his hands lingered above the keys for a few seconds before slowly falling to his lap. The final chord hung in the air, soft and fragile. Then silence, the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. For a moment, no one said anything. Then someone clapped softly. Soon everyone joined in, clapping not loudly but with deep respect and wonder. The artist opened his eyes, surprised. He looked around, almost shy, as if he hadn't realized people were listening. A faint smile appeared on his face, and the kind of smile that comes from deep inside. That was beautiful, the waitress said quietly. "I didn't know you could play like that." He nodded gently, his eyes soft. "Neither did I," he said, almost to himself. After that day, everything started to change. People who came into the cafe began to ask about him. Who was that man who played the piano? Is he the same one who paints the walls outside? Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Videos of his impromptu performance appeared online, short clips recorded by people who had been there. In one video, you could see him lost in the music, unaware of the world around him. The comments under the video were full of admiration. "Wow, that's the same guy who paints the murals on Maple Street? This is pure soul." His hands tell stories, both on walls and keys. In just a few days, the quiet street artist had become something more, a mystery that now had sound. but to him nothing really changed. The next morning he was back on Maple Street, painting again as if nothing had happened. Yet those who watched closely noticed something different in his art. The new mural he started had a rhythm, almost like the flow of music. The colors danced together more freely. It felt like the music he played the day before had found its way into his paint. The cafe owner, who had been out that rainy day, heard the story from his staff and begged the artist to play again sometime. "People loved it," he said. "You brought life into this place." The artist smiled politely but said nothing. Maybe he wasn't ready yet. Maybe that small performance had opened something fragile inside him, something that needed time. Still, each time he passed the cafe, he would glance at the piano through the window. Sometimes he even went in for coffee, sitting quietly near the same spot. The staff would joke, "You sure you don't want to play today?" And he'd just smile. But there was always that look in his eyes, like he was thinking about it. The piano had woken up something inside him, a part of his past that he had buried under years of paint and silence. For the first time in a long time, he had felt a different kind of peace, the kind that only music could bring. The people of Maple Street began to talk about him even more. He wasn't just the mural guy anymore. He was the artist who paints and plays. Some even started calling him the painter with a piano. It became part of the neighborhood's charm, a story people shared with pride. One evening, after finishing another mural, he stayed a little longer than usual. The sun was setting, painting the sky in orange and gold. He looked at his work, a picture of two hands touching piano keys that seemed to glow with light. He stood there quietly, then smiled faintly as if he knew this was only the beginning of something. That night he walked toward the cafe again. The lights inside were warm and a few people were still there. He stood outside for a while, looking at the piano through the window, his reflection blending with its shape. Then he whispered softly, almost to himself, "Maybe tomorrow." He turned and walked away slowly into the night, his footsteps echoing on the wet street. The city slept, unaware that something truly beautiful was beginning to unfold. Story that would soon make everyone look at the quiet street, artist in a completely new way. A week had passed since that rainy afternoon in the cafe, but people were still talking about it. The sound of that piano, the soft notes that had filled the room like sunlight, had stayed in everyone's minds. Those who heard him play couldn't forget it, and those who missed it wished they had been there. The artist, however, didn't seem much different. Every morning, he still arrived at Maple Street with his cart of paint and brushes. He still worked quietly, his head bent, focused on the wall as if the world behind him didn't exist. Yet there was a small change in him that only a few people noticed. He hummed now, very softly, while painting. Not a song anyone recognized, just a tune that seemed to come from deep inside him. The new mural he started was unlike anything he had done before. It showed a piano standing in the middle of the street, its keys glowing like stars. Around it were people, some sitting, some standing, all listening. You could almost hear the music through the colors. Every line, every shade seemed to move with rhythm. The passers-by were amazed. "Look," a young boy said to his mother. "He's painting the piano from the cafe." The mother smiled. "Yes, I think he is," word spread quickly again. "He's mixing his art with his music now," people said. "Maybe he'll play again." One evening, as the artist packed up his paints, the cafe owner came outside. "You've made quite a name for yourself," he said kindly. "People come here asking about you every day. Some even sit in the cafe hoping you'll play again." The artist smiled faintly but didn't say much. He just nodded and looked at his half-finished mural. The cafe owner paused, watching him for a moment. Then he said gently, "You know, that piano used to belong to my wife. She played it every night until she got sick. I couldn't bring myself to move it or sell it. But the way you played the other day, it felt like the piano came alive again." The artist looked at him, his eyes soft. "It's a beautiful instrument," he said quietly. "It has a soul." The owner smiled sadly. "Maybe so, but I think it needed someone like you to remind it how to sing again." That night, after the streets emptied, the artist didn't go home right away. He sat on the curb, staring at his mural under the streetlights. His hands rested on his knees and his fingers moved slightly, as if still pressing invisible keys. Memories flooded back, soft, painful, and beautiful all at once. He remembered another piano, not in a cafe, but in a bright room with sunlight streaming through tall windows. He remembered laughter, the sound of a woman's voice and a little boy's giggles as small fingers tried to copy the melody. Those were days filled with music and warmth. Days that had ended too soon. He had stopped playing after that day. The piano keys had become too heavy to touch. The silence had become his way of surviving. Painting had been the only way to let his feelings breathe without breaking apart. But that afternoon in the cafe, something inside him had shifted. The moment his fingers touched the keys again, all those old emotions had returned. It was like meeting an old friend he thought he'd never see again. He sighed, looking up at the night sky. The stars looked faint, hidden behind city lights, but they were still there. He whispered softly, "Maybe it's time." The next morning he returned to the cafe earlier than usual. The piano was still there, waiting. The waitress looked surprised to see him. "You're here early," she said, smiling. He nodded, walking straight to the piano. "Mind if I play a little?" "Of course not," she said happily. He sat down, gently lifted the cover, and placed his fingers on the keys again. This time he didn't hesitate. The melody that came out was different, brighter, hopeful, almost like a sunrise. The notes floated through the air, warm and full of life. The waitress stopped wiping the counter and just listened. As he played, people passing by outside stopped too. The cafe's door was open, and the sound spilled out onto the street. A small crowd gathered near the window, watching quietly. The same man who sold flowers across the road leaned on his cart, listening. The kids who loved watching him paint stood barefoot in the doorway, their faces glowing with wonder. Inside, the music seemed to wrap around everyone. The cafe owner came out of the kitchen wiping his hands and stood there motionless. Even the coffee machine's hum seemed to quiet down, as if it didn't want to interrupt. When the song ended, the room remained silent again. That beautiful kind of silence, filled with emotion. Then someone clapped softly. Then another. Soon the cafe was full of gentle applause. The artist looked up, smiled slightly, and nodded. "You should do this more often," the cafe owner said warmly. "People need this." The artist didn't answer. He just said quietly, "Music heals, even when words can't." Over the next few weeks, the cafe became a special place. Every Sunday afternoon, the artist would stop painting a bit early, clean his hands, and walk into the cafe. People from all around the neighborhood started showing up, not just for coffee, but for the music. Families came, old couples held hands, kids sat cross-legged on the floor near the piano. He never announced it. He never charged money. He just played. Sometimes gentle tunes that made people close their eyes and dream. Other times powerful melodies that made their hearts race. One afternoon, a young man with a camera asked, "Sir, what's your name? People online want to know who you are." The artist smiled softly and said, "I'm just someone who paints and plays." That simple answer made people like him even more. He became something rare, an artist who didn't chase fame, who didn't seek attention. Everything he did came from the heart. Soon, news about him reached beyond Maple Street. A local newspaper published a small article titled, "The Street Painter Who Plays Like a Poet." The piece included a picture of him painting and a photo of him at the cafe piano, head slightly bowed, eyes closed in music. One of the readers who saw that article recognized him. It was a man who used to work at a small concert hall years ago. He looked at the picture again and whispered, "It's him." He remembered a young pianist who once filled rooms with emotion, who could make people cry without saying a single word. That pianist had disappeared suddenly after a terrible tragedy. The man picked up his phone and called the newspaper. A few days later, a reporter came to Maple Street to talk to the artist. She found him painting as usual. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I'm from the Daily Echo. I wanted to ask, did you used to be a pianist years ago? Your music sounds very familiar." The artist paused, the paintbrush frozen in his hand. He looked at her for a long time, then gave a faint smile. "I used to be," he said quietly. "A long time ago. Why did you stop?" she asked gently. He looked at the wall, where bright colors danced across the bricks. His voice was soft when he finally spoke. "Life happened," he said. "Sometimes the music stops, but it finds its way back in another form." The reporter didn't push further. She thanked him and left, her heart heavy and inspired at the same time. When her story came out, it touched everyone who read it. The headline said, "The Street Artist Who Found His Music Again." It spoke of loss, silence, and healing, how art had saved a man's spirit and how music had brought him back to life. People from far away started visiting Maple Street, not just for his murals but to feel what his story represented. Hope. One afternoon, after finishing a beautiful mural of piano keys that stretched across the wall like a rainbow, he stepped back and smiled. The cafe owner came out wiping his hands. "Another masterpiece," he said proudly. "You've given this street something no one else could." The artist looked at the mural, then at the piano inside the cafe. "No," he said softly. "The people gave it meaning. I just painted what I felt." The owner nodded. "You know, when you play, you remind everyone that there's still goodness in this world." The artist smiled, looking at his hands. "I used to think I lost that part of me forever," he said. "But maybe it was just waiting for the right time to come back." The owner smiled. "Maybe it was waiting for the rain." They both laughed quietly. As the sun set behind the buildings, the colors of the mural glowed golden. The sound of laughter and music drifted from the cafe as evening lights flickered on. The street that was once just another gray corner of the city had become alive, full of warmth, stories and connection, and the artist, who once hid behind paint and silence, had slowly begun to find his voice again, not through fame or recognition, but through the quiet power of creation, kindness, and sound. Nobody knew how deeply his story ran, but everyone could feel it. And as the soft notes of the piano floated out into the night air once more, it was clear. This was only the middle of his journey. It had been months since the artist's first public performance in the cafe, and the quiet street had changed. The murals on the walls had become landmarks. The piano in the cafe corner had become almost sacred to the neighborhood. And yet the artist remained as humble and quiet as ever. He still walked down Maple Street every morning with his paint-stained hands, carrying his brushes and cans, greeting familiar faces with only a nod or a soft smile. But there were days when he looked lost, his gaze distant, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared the paints. Sometimes after finishing a mural, he would sit on the curb for a long time, staring at nothing in particular. The people of the street had learned to give him space. They had sensed that there was more to his story, a deeper pain that no music or painting could fully erase. One afternoon, the cafe owner approached him cautiously as he cleaned his brushes. "Do you ever think about why you stopped playing?" he asked softly. The artist paused and looked at the wall he had just painted. It was a vivid depiction of a small boy sitting at a piano, his fingers reaching for the keys, a faint smile on his face. The image was so full of emotion that it made the cafe owner take a step back. "I think about it every day," the artist said quietly. "Sometimes the memory comes like a storm, sudden and overwhelming. Other times it's gentle, like a whisper. But it's always there." The cafe owner nodded slowly. "People love your music. But it's clear it comes from somewhere deep. Maybe it's time the world knew your story." The artist shook his head lightly. "Not yet. Some stories aren't ready to be told." Still, that evening as he walked home along the quiet streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. Something inside him was urging him to finally face the past. He walked past the cafe and glanced at the piano. The soft light of the cafe spilled onto the wet pavement, and he remembered a room filled with sunlight, laughter, and music. It had been years. So many years that he had almost convinced himself the memory was someone else's. But the piano in that memory wasn't just an instrument. It was the center of his life. It had been his mother's. She had been a talented pianist, gentle and patient, who taught him to play before he could even read music. She had loved music more than anything, and she had poured all her heart into him. But one winter evening, she had fallen ill. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and sickness, and the machines beeped constantly. He had played the piano at home, hoping to bring her some comfort. But when he returned to the hospital that night, she was gone. The music stopped in him too. He couldn't bring himself to touch a piano again. Every note reminded him of the emptiness, the grief, the loss. Since then, he had buried himself in paint. He had poured all his emotions into walls, streets, and colors. Music had been locked away in a box in his heart, waiting. That night, he sat alone in his small apartment. The room was quiet except for the hum of the radiator. He stared at a small old photo on the table. His mother sitting at a grand piano, her hands poised elegantly on the keys, a faint smile on her face. He hadn't looked at it in years. The photo made his chest ache. For the first time, tears came freely. He didn't try to stop them. The grief he had held for so long poured out quietly, slowly, and yet, beneath the sadness there was a spark, a tiny voice telling him that he could honor her memory, that he could play again, not just for himself but for the people who needed to hear the music that came from deep inside. The next morning he returned to Maple Street earlier than usual. The sky was pale with the first light of dawn and the air was crisp. He carried his brushes and paint cans, but his mind was elsewhere, on the piano and the memories it held. As he walked past the cafe, he noticed a small crowd had already gathered outside. Some were waiting for their morning coffee, others just standing by the window hoping to catch a glimpse of him. He paused, took a deep breath, and decided it was time. He went inside. The cafe was quiet, only a few regulars were there, sipping their drinks. He approached the piano. The keys looked worn, familiar yet inviting. He sat down and placed his hands gently on the keys. For a long moment he didn't play. He just felt the wood under his fingers, the coolness of the keys, the weight of memories. Then slowly, he pressed a single note. It sounded weak, tentative, but it was enough. Another note followed, then another, and suddenly the music began to flow. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was real. It was raw. It carried every ounce of pain, love, grief, and hope that had been locked inside him for so many years. The cafe fell silent. People stopped their conversations, put down their cups, and listened. The sound of the piano filled the room, moving like water, gentle at times, crashing at others. He played for hours, not thinking about anyone, not thinking about fame or attention. He played for his mother, for the boy he had been, for the part of himself that had been lost. Each note told a story that words could not. It was as if the piano itself remembered, as if it had been waiting all these years for him to return. When he finally stopped, the cafe was completely still. Then slowly the applause began, not loud, not frantic, but full of respect, awe, and understanding. People didn't just clap for the music. They clapped for the courage it took to play, for the vulnerability he had shown, for the story that finally found its voice. The artist stood up, his hands shaking slightly. He looked around at the faces filled with warmth, curiosity, and admiration. He didn't know them all, but he felt connected to them in a way he hadn't felt in years. The cafe owner approached him, eyes glistening. That was incredible," he said softly. "Thank you for sharing that." The artist nodded, his voice quiet but steady. "Thank you for letting me." From that day, the artist began to open up slowly. He started sharing small pieces of his story with the neighborhood. People learned about the mother who had taught him to play, about the grief that had silenced him, about the years spent painting walls to cope, and in sharing, he began to heal. The murals he painted started to reflect this new chapter. They were no longer just beautiful patterns or abstract colors. They told stories of love, loss, hope, and resilience. The street became a living gallery of emotion, drawing people from far and wide. And the piano, it became a symbol, not just of music but of courage, of confronting pain, of finding one's voice after years of silence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the buildings, casting golden light across the street, the artist sat at the piano once more. The cafe was quiet, a few people lingering after dinner. He began to play a soft, gentle tune, one that spoke of memories, love, and healing. A little girl came in with her mother and stood near the piano, mesmerized. She had never seen anyone play like this before. "Mom," she whispered, "it's like he's telling a story without words." Her mother smiled. "Yes, sweetheart. That's the power of music." The artist looked up briefly, saw the awe on their faces, and felt a quiet peace settle over him. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel alone. The grief was still there, yes, but it was no longer a cage. It was a part of him, a part of his music, a part of his art. He played long into the evening, each note carrying both sorrow and hope. And as the night grew darker, and the city lights flickered on, the people of Maple Street realized that they weren't just listening to music or admiring murals. They were witnessing a man reclaim his life piece by piece, note by note, brushstroke by brushstroke. The street artist who had once hidden behind walls and silence had finally found his voice. And in finding it, he gave everyone who watched and listened a gift far greater than paint or music alone. He gave them a story of courage, of healing, and of the power to start again, no matter how deep the pain. After months of slowly sharing his story and music, the artist began to feel something he hadn't experienced in years: belonging. The streets of the neighborhood were no longer just paths he walked daily. They had become part of him, part of his life and part of the story he was finally living. People stopped seeing him as just the street painter or the quiet man who plays the piano. They began to see him as someone who had lived through pain, found a way to heal, and now shared the beauty of his journey with everyone. One bright morning, the cafe owner opened the door to find the artist standing outside with a gentle smile. In his hands, he held a small wooden case. He carried it carefully, almost reverently, as if it contained something precious. And it did. Inside was a compact, foldable keyboard he had purchased, old but clean, with keys that gleamed in the sunlight. I thought, maybe I could bring music to the street itself, he said quietly, for everyone to hear, even those who can't come to the cafe. The cafe owner's eyes widened. That's wonderful. People would love it. That day, for the first time, he set the keyboard on the corner of Maple Street and began to play. The morning was quiet, save for the occasional sound of distant traffic and birds. He pressed the first keys softly, testing the flow. Then gradually the notes became stronger, more confident. The music floated down the street like a gentle breeze. Curious neighbors peeked out of their windows. Shopkeepers leaned on their counters. Children stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, mesmerized. People who were hurrying to work slowed their pace. And then, without being told, they began to gather. A small crowd at first, then more, and then even more. He didn't announce his presence. He didn't ask anyone to stop. He just played. And people listened. A woman who worked at the bakery across the street wiped her hands and walked closer, tears forming in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered to herself. "It's like he's telling all of us something we forgot how to feel." A little boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, can we stay and listen?" The father nodded, smiling, and bent down to sit on the curb with him. The artist didn't notice them all at first. His eyes were closed, his hands moving over the keys with a rhythm that seemed natural, like breathing. Each note carried emotion: grief, hope, joy, sorrow, love, all woven together in a melody that made the street itself seem alive. As he played, he noticed a few familiar faces in the crowd: the young boy who had first recognized the mural of the piano, the flower vendor who always stopped to watch, and even the man from the concert hall who had once recognized him years ago. They smiled, nodding in quiet acknowledgement. When he finally stopped, a deep silence filled the street. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the music had created a bubble around them, a private world shared for a moment in time. Then slowly the applause began. First one clap, then another, until the street echoed with genuine, heartfelt appreciation. He stood up, breathing heavily but smiling. "Thank you," he said softly, though most of the people couldn't hear him over the echo of their own awe. He packed up his keyboard and walked back to the cafe. Word about the street performances spread quickly. Soon people came from different parts of the city just to see him play, to witness the quiet man whose music could make hearts ache and swell at the same time. But he never asked for attention. He never asked for money. He played because he wanted to share something pure, something honest, something that could remind people of the power of beauty in everyday life. The murals he painted also began to tell this new chapter of his life. They became brighter, more joyful. Children skipping along the street could almost step into the painted worlds. A tree that seemed to sway in the wind. Birds that looked ready to fly off the wall. Pianos with glowing keys and notes that seemed to float into the air. Every day he added a small piece, a brushstroke of hope. One afternoon, a group of music students from a nearby school came by, curious to see the street pianist. They stood quietly as he played, not daring to interrupt, captivated by the skill and emotion in every note. When he finished, one of them stepped forward. "Tie of life in a melody that would never end." "Sir," the young girl said nervously, "your music, it's amazing. Would you teach us?" The artist looked at her for a long moment. He could see the hope in her eyes, the same kind of hope he had once felt when he first touched a piano. For a second, he thought about all the years he had spent away from music, the pain that had kept him silent. But then he realized something. He had survived, he had returned, and now he had a chance to pass on something greater than skill. He could pass on resilience, courage, and love for the music itself. He nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "I will." From that day on, his life transformed even more. The cafe became not only a place for music but also a small school of sorts. Children and adults alike came to learn, to explore, to find the joy he had rediscovered. And with every lesson, he realized that teaching was different from performing. It required patience, attention, and empathy. But it also healed him further, reminding him that the pain he had carried for so long could be transformed into something positive, something that could touch many lives. He even began to tell small parts of his story to the students and about his mother, about the years of silence, about the moment he found music again. The students listened in awe, understanding that the lessons were not just about music but about life. One rainy evening, as he looked out from the cafe window at the glistening street, he noticed a man standing under the awning across the street, watching the murals and the piano with quiet admiration. The man smiled at him and he recognized the same man from the concert hall who had first noticed him years ago. "You've done well," the man said softly when they met later, "not just with music but with life. You turned your pain into something that gives hope to everyone around you." "That's rare," the artist smiled faintly. "I'm just learning," he said quietly. "Learning how to live again, one note at a time." The man nodded. "And yet you've taught more people than you can imagine. They'll never forget this." The seasons changed and Maple Street became a place of quiet magic. Flowers bloomed along the sidewalks. Colorful murals adorned every corner, and music floated through the air like an invisible thread tying everyone together. The street had become a living testament to hope, creativity, and the human spirit. Even the people who had been skeptical at first now stopped to watch, to listen, to smile. The children laughed freely near the murals. Parents held hands as they walked, and strangers from other parts of the city discovered a small piece of joy they didn't know they needed. The artist himself had changed. He no longer carried the heavy silence of grief. The memories of loss were still there, but they no longer weighed him down. He had learned to honor them through music, through art, through connection. And with every brushstroke and every note, he felt lighter, freer, more alive. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with gold and pink, he sat at the piano in the cafe. A small crowd had gathered, and for the first time he allowed himself to look at each face. He smiled softly, a deep, genuine smile that carried years of pain and healing. He began to play a melody, one that started softly, almost like a whisper, and gradually grew into a rich, powerful tune. It was a song of hope, of love, of life continuing despite everything. The crowd listened, some with tears in their eyes, others with wide smiles, but all felt the same thing, the beauty of someone who had faced darkness and come out the other side. When he finished, the applause was long and heartfelt. He stood, bowed lightly, and looked around. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. The street, the people, the music, the murals, all of it had come together to create something greater than himself. And in that moment, he realized the truth he had been discovering for months. Life may bring pain, but it also brings opportunity. Opportunity to heal, to create, to connect, and to inspire. Music and art were not just expressions. They were lifelines, bridges, and gifts. And through them, he had found not only himself again, but a community, a purpose, and a life full of meaning. As the night deepened and the stars appeared above Maple Street, the artist packed up his keyboard and walked down the street, brushing his paint-stained hands together. The murals glowed softly in the streetlights, and he felt a quiet pride. He had started as a man with a secret, a street painter hiding from life. And now he had become a storyteller, a creator whose music, murals, and courage had touched countless lives. The street was no longer just a corner of the city. It was alive with music, color, hope, and love. And the artist? He had finally found his place in it all. The journey was far from over. There would be more music to play, more murals to paint, more stories to share. But for the first time, he knew that the past would not hold him back. It was a part of him, yes, but it was not his cage. He had reclaimed his life, one note, one brushstroke, and one kind gesture at a time. And as he walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, the faint hum of a melody lingered in his heart. A melody that spoke of hope, resilience, and the bow.